Wish TV puts education first.
Welcome to Top Story. I'm Ken Owen. Legislators in the 1993 Indiana General Assembly convened facing some very difficult decisions. And an Illinois couple who left their children home alone raised new concerns about an old problem.
By now, everyone has heard of the bizarre case of David and Sharon Shue. They are the parents accused of leaving their children home alone in a Chicago suburb over the Christmas holidays, while they vacationed in Mexico for 9 days. But on day 2, a smoke alarm goes off, and 9-year-old Nicole and 4-year-old Diana are forced to leave their home for a neighbor's house in fear. The next day, authorities learned what was going on.
I just left the kids in the house and said, you know, where's your mom and dad? Oh, they're in Mexico.
What was it like for you being all alone in the house? Was that scary?
Yeah, it was quite scary. Sometimes it was and sometimes not. Well, when it was time for my parents to come home, I get a little scared on that part.
Are you sorry that you had to be left alone like that? Is that how did that feel?
For a long time, I would feel really bad, wondering what they were doing and where they are.
When the Shues returned from their Mexican vacation, authorities and reporters were waiting for them at Chicago's O'Hare Airport.
David, can you tell us why you left your kids alone at Christmas? Did they ask about the kids at all? No, they did not.
The Shues were arrested and charged with child abandonment, cruelty to children, and child endangerment. For now, the Shues' children remain in the care of foster parents. Unlike the circumstances in the Hollywood movie Home Alone, this was no accident. The Shues apparently knew exactly what they were doing. And in this real-life sequel, there is no happy ending. The Shues will have to go to court to get their children back. This was not your typical opening for the Indiana General Assembly. But lawmakers returned to the State House last Tuesday facing a myriad of problems, most of them having to do with money.
Every session is different, and this one may be more different than any of the others.
Between now and the end of April, lawmakers must find a way to cut Medicaid expenses and create a new state budget that includes the following demands from the governor.
Some increases for education, some increases for the other things about which we care, and still hold the line on taxes. I want to emphasize, Jim, that it will not be easy.
In fact, the obstacles are so great that the House Speaker is already trying to kill rumors that the legislature will need to go into overtime.
We'll be able to get our work done in a timely fashion. I see absolutely no reason for special sessions.
That doesn't mean it will be easy.
It is going to be an intense session before we're finished.
What can Hoosiers expect from the 1993 General Assembly? Does the end result mean a tax increase? And how frequent are home alone cases and other types of child neglect here in central Indiana? We'll look for answers to these questions and more as we examine this week's Top Story.
Cases of child abuse and neglect have no economic boundaries. All children can be at risk. The case of Sharon and David Shue is alarming, but not unique. Since their arrest, the Shues have said nothing publicly, but we have learned that Sharon Shue did talk to authorities. According to a source, she told police she did not feel she'd done anything wrong. Her attitude seemed to be, so what? While her husband still refuses to answer questions, it's also been learned the Shues told the children before they left for Mexico the kids could only eat 2 meals a day. They were limited to only dry cereal for breakfast and microwave meals for dinner. Their parents kept a detailed inventory of the food in the house, and they warned the children they would be punished if they ate anything else. And even more disturbing, investigators say 4-year-old Diana could make only grunting noises and seemed unable to speak. In just a moment on Top Story, we'll hear from 2 people who work with child abuse and neglect cases every day. Joining us from the Family Advocacy Center will be Lieutenant Emil Daggy, and Susan Hoppe from Child Protection Services here in Indianapolis will also be speaking with us. And later, we'll ask our political analyst Brian Vargus to look into his crystal ball and give us some idea of what to expect from the 1993 Indiana General Assembly and the 103rd U.S. Congress. But first, child molestation is one of the most reported forms of child abuse, and a bizarre case is currently being investigated by local authorities. An Indianapolis man faces 3 counts of child molesting involving his 14-year-old stepdaughter. The couple thought they were actually teaching their daughter about sex. News 8's Rick Dawson looks at the allegations in this strange case.
Mom and Dad were concerned about the daughter's first sexual experience being painful. So together they discussed that they were going to go out and buy a rubber phallus and molest her so that her first sexual encounter would not be painful.
It happened in the summer of 1991 at this Southeast Side home. The parents bought an X-rated videotape for the three to watch. They draped the 14-year-old teen's lower body so she couldn't see what was happening. The mother stood by and held the girl's hand.
After the father initiated the penetration with the device, this was too painful for the daughter, so at this time he penetrated her himself.
The mother reported this case to authorities, but before they found out how involved she was, they made a deal with her where she wouldn't be prosecuted.
My hands are tied. There's not a thing I can do.
These are the difficult decisions that have to be made in prosecution every day. Unfortunately,
Prosecutor Jeff Modisette said the deputy prosecutor who handled the case thought she was offering immunity on a charge of failure to report, but the agreement provided for no prosecution at all.
Even if she had known everything, we may very well have said, well, it's more important that the child be protected. That has to be our number one priority to get the actual perpetrator in jail, and so we may have very well come up with the same decision anyway.
The father has been charged with 3 counts of child molesting but has not yet been arrested. The couple has divorced and remarried 3 times. They're currently going through another divorce, but the stepfather is living in an apartment right across the street from his former home, and the teenager is still in her mother's custody. On the South Side, Rick Dawson, WISH TV, News 8.
We're joined now by Lieutenant Emil Daggy of the Child Advocacy Center. And Lieutenant, it seems as though in the past 5, certainly 10 years, family and child issues have become a bigger and bigger part of our society, and certainly big news stories. I know you can't talk about individual specific cases, especially pending cases, but why is it that we're seeing more of a focus on these issues?
Well, I think that the public in general is much better educated than they used to be. I think that society in general is starting to realize that a lot of the problems that we have with, especially with criminals and juvenile behavior and things of that nature, are a direct result of the way that children are raised and the parenting skills that are used to raise them. So they're important issues. Children get educated in the school system, and there's programs, as we have in Indianapolis, called the Good Touch, Bad Touch program, that make children aware that things like that do happen, and that they do have people that they can talk to that will listen to them and that they can trust. So the number of reports have went up dramatically maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and in the last 2 or 3 years we've leveled off a little bit. This year we went over 600 in child molest in the sheriff's jurisdiction, and we're running close to 300 on neglect and abuse cases.
Do you feel it's a response to people realizing that there are some things that shouldn't be done? Is it just better reporting, or are there more cases out there?
I think it's better reporting. I don't think that child molest is any more prevalent now than it has been probably all through history. It's just better reported and
Let's
better
talk a little bit about the Home Alone case, because I know there are a lot of parents out there who are wondering at this point, Susan Hoppe, what is correct behavior when it comes to their children and leaving them alone? We were talking before the broadcast this morning, and there are no hard and fast rules in Indiana as far as laws are concerned, but what should parents keep in mind?
Indiana doesn't have any age limit on what's acceptable legally to leave a child home alone, and when Child Protection Service goes in to investigate a case, they have to do a risk assessment based on a multitude of factors. Certainly the age of the child is important, the child's emotional maturity and mental abilities, the time period that you're talking about the child being left alone, the responsibilities that the child has while the child is alone. Is there a backup system? Is there a neighbor that knows this child is alone? Do they know how to access emergency numbers? Is this a situation where it's very well thought out and the backup system is in place, or is it chronic? Is it episodic? Does the parent leave the child every Saturday night? Is it a matter of economics, where the parent is very aware and feels that this is not something that they want to do but can't afford child care? So when Child Protection goes in, they assess a multitude of factors and help really a parent assess what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. There are no hard and fast rules, but those are the kinds of things that one should look at when making a decision.
And within days of the case in suburban Chicago, we had a similar case in Detroit where a woman was arrested, then a few days later a case in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Did your two agencies receive a flurry of phone calls after the Home Alone case broke in Chicago?
Well, I haven't had a flurry of phone calls, but we do get phone calls on a daily basis from parents, and I get a lot of phone calls from officers that are street officers that respond to calls where children have been left alone. Usually what they do is we discuss the circumstances that surround the child being left alone. As Ms. Hoppe said, in Indiana there's no specific age, which I think probably is a good idea, because then you have to assess each case individually and look at the circumstances that surround the incident. An example would be a 10-year-old that's left alone with a 4-, 5-, and 3-year-old to watch them while mom goes to the store, assuming that they have emergency numbers and know how to get a hold of mom, or maybe a neighbor that they could contact, would be an acceptable situation. The same 10-year-old left with those children for 2 or 3 days at a time is not acceptable.
Have we had a Home Alone case in central Indiana that would rival what's happening in Chicago, or is this a rarity, an anomaly?
I would say this is really a rare situation. We haven't had any, to my knowledge, that have been this extreme.
Usually kids being left in cars when parents go shopping, things like that.
After school, or putting kids to bed and going out for the evening kind of thing is something we get calls about.
We'll be back with Top Story and continue our discussion in just a moment. Don't go away. Good morning and welcome back to Top Story. I'm Ken Owen, and Lieutenant Emil Daggy, we were talking earlier about the Home Alone case in Chicago and the fact that Indiana does not have any laws that say specifically if you have a 12-year-old, you can leave that child home alone while you go on vacation, but if they're younger than 12, don't do that. Does Indiana need laws that specifically address ages and behaviors that parents should engage in?
Well, I think the Indiana law is adequate. It gives you the option of evaluating each individual situation and the surrounding circumstances. I think if you specifically said a 12-year-old, could be left home alone, then you run into the problem that there may be a lot of the times when children are left alone, that's not the only issue, that there are other neglect issues that are going on also. So I think that the way the law is now, that it gives us a broader scope of how we investigate cases. I think parents, it's just common sense rules, I mean. And the law specifically says that you have to knowingly or intentionally. I mean, if an average person would know that leaving my child alone, a 5- or 6-year-old alone, for a complete day without any emergency phone numbers, nobody to contact, they wouldn't know what to do in an emergency situation, is unacceptable. I mean, most people would know that.
We were talking about the numbers of cases, and they continue to grow in terms of child abuse, molestations, cases that are reported to police agencies in Marion County and throughout central Indiana. What are the challenges facing your agencies as you get more and more cases in, Susan?
Certainly the challenges facing our agency are, well, the numbers. We cannot accommodate doing very, very thorough investigations. We have to go in and make very quick judgments because of the multitude of cases. Probably the biggest challenge is, in fact, the numbers, and trying to accommodate that with the staff that we currently have. In terms of the Home Alone, I did take a look at some of the statistics and noticed that we are running about 30 cases per month of indicated and substantiated lack of supervision kinds of cases. So with lack of supervision cases, we're dealing with about 30 a month, and then with the way we intervene depends certainly on our assessment. Can be anything from a talking to intervention of the court. But the biggest challenge is the numbers and trying to provide services to all those families and quality services.
Well, it seems, Lieutenant Daggy, that there's a crisis on both ends. You have families in crisis because many families are single-parent homes or families where both people have to work, and what do you do with the kids? On the other hand, the budget crisis. Every state and local municipality across the country seems to be having trouble making ends meet, and you need more money to provide the services that are needed to investigate these kind of cases.
I think that the majority of children that are left alone because of economic conditions that single parents that work, or two parents that work, and the child gets home from school and is left home 2 and 3 hours before the parents go home from work. And I think we as a society need to provide some kind of care for those children, especially during the summer. These parents still have to work, and then they have to come up with acceptable babysitting situations. So, and in those situations, I mean, those are the kinds of things where we get called a lot because the children are left unattended. You know, they go outside, they're on the streets, they get in trouble.
The media is criticized, and rightfully so sometimes, but people often say to us, why do you broadcast these stories about child molestations, about children being left home alone, the stories that involve children, and they are becoming more prominent. I think we've talked about that. Do you think, though, that this is sending an important message out? Is it changing behavior in letting people know that things are wrong, things that perhaps in the past weren't talked about?
I think that just the number of reports that came in 1986, when I came into this particular unit in the Sheriff's Department, they were investigating about 186 molest cases a year, and now we're over 600 a year, and the physical abuse has gone up approximately the same amount, which indicates that the educational process within the community is much better. People are much more aware of it. I think that people are starting to see that the link between the way children are raised and what they become when they become adults, delinquency and how children are raised, domestic violence and violence against children in the family. I mean, all those things are interrelated. I think that they're starting to become a focus in trying to, confront and maybe solve some of the issues that we have with delinquency and adult criminals.
And the cycle.
And the cycle.
Lieutenant Emil Daggy, thank you for joining us. Susan Hoppe, thanks for joining us this morning on Top Story. Up next, lawmakers are back on the job at the State House and on Capitol Hill. Some ideas on what we can expect. The 103rd U.S. Congress was sworn in last Tuesday amid hopes for an end to years of gridlock. After all the ceremonies, both Republicans and Democrats pledged to get down to work on issues that dominated their campaigns. The new members of Congress say they've waited a long time, and they say they're very eager to take on the new challenges that lie ahead.
We all understand we're very reform-minded on health care, and we're going to be responsive to our constituency. It's how we approach it where we might have differences.
The lawmakers are expected to hold off on making any major decisions until January 20th. That is, of course, when President-elect Bill Clinton takes office. Well, joining us now is News 8's political analyst and, you might say, resident curmudgeon at times, Brian Vargus. Always fun to talk to you, Brian. And Bill Clinton found out he faces some special challenges in this past week when President Bush released the budget deficit figures on Wednesday, showing that the deficit is going to be much larger than what we had anticipated earlier.
And then, of course, as in the case of all, I think, politicians, he immediately forgot his goal of reducing the deficit by 1/2 in 4 years, because it's obviously going to be extremely difficult to do. At all levels of government, we're seeing the same thing, and that is no money, demands for services, and it goes right down the line, and nobody wants to talk about tax increases. The most creative thing I think you're going to see is, out of all levels of government, is different ways to call a tax increase something other than a tax increase.
Revenue enhancement.
Yeah, revenue enhancement, users' fees, whatever it is. But instead of the L word, it's no T word this time.
Well, we're getting down to crunch time for the new president, and he's had his economic summit. There have been a lot of showy things in which a lot of ideas have been bandied about, but now he has to come up with some specific policies and present them to this Congress. And we've talked even before the election, the crucial thing for Bill Clinton will be to have some ideas in place so when he takes office, he can get these things through quickly.
Well, I think you still have to remember he's got a lot of symbolic things he can do. This week they've talked about family leave coming back up again. All right, this doesn't really cost the government anything, and it has some impact on certain levels of business, but it's showy and it can be done easily. It will pass. It doesn't have to go over his veto. So there's a number of things he can do. In terms of a budget package and real economic impact, he's still going to go for some sort of investment credit tax incentives. He's still going to work on the infrastructure. But how much he can do of that is really an open question. And remember, his budget doesn't go into effect for a full year. He's still working on a George Bush budget. So he does have a while to play, and he will. And remember, he is a consensus builder, but he's got a Congress that even in his own party, the majority of them are not terribly pleased with him, and a number of them ran against him in early primaries.
But they're all in the same boat, and many people are looking at this and saying this may be the one shining moment for the Democratic Party. With the Democratic Congress and the Democratic White House, there won't be much blame to go around anymore.
Well, that's, of course, the fundamental issue. The Democrats have, for the last 20 to 30 years, been labeled the tax and spend party. And if they have to go in there with a Democrat tax increase, they've reinforced that image. What they've got to do is find a very creative way to raise revenue without it being called a tax increase.
Well, the creativity is going to be needed at the state level, too. We have the State House, the state lawmakers back in session, and Governor Bai has held to that no new taxes pledge before. He wouldn't make it in the last campaign. Are we in line for a tax increase in Indiana?
The governor, I think, is very sincere in what he says and what he believes, and that is that leadership does not necessarily mean raising taxes. However, in the face of what is an immense strain on Medicaid, an immense problem in education, an immense problem in the infrastructure, you really have to ask yourself, does revenue enhancement really call for that kind of leadership? Or is it better that instead of this tragic case in Chicago of somebody being left home alone, that we ask the legislature to go home and leave us alone in a certain sense? Because at this point, I think what we may be facing is a case of, if I can coin a term, political molestation on the part of the legislature. They're going to sit over there, and it's going to be an intense session. There's going to be a lot of bickering, and it's going to be up to the governor to lead them. And it's really an open question in a lot of people's minds about whether he's up to this.
And the governor has political stock involved. Obviously, if he has his sights set on an office in 4 years, he doesn't want to raise taxes and have that held against him.
He's probably got his sights set in 6 years rather than 4, but he obviously would like to keep the State House in Democratic hands, and Lieutenant Governor Frank O'Bannon has a great deal to lose if there's a Democrat tax increase. The Republicans have dug in firmly, no tax increase. Many of the Democrats themselves don't want it, and people very close to the governor have said again and again, a tax increase is not necessarily leadership. But again, I'll go back to the same point. When is a tax increase a tax increase? There's other things that you can call it. Right. You can also have a crisis of one sort or another that might push you into it. Certainly, the teachers, the labor unions, state employees, the mental health network, none of those groups are going to sit there quietly and just accept either a frozen or cut in their budget. They're going to make a lot of noise, and these are constituencies that have to be dealt with. And I think a lot of legislators are going to be looking over their shoulder very, very carefully in this session.
Brian Vargus, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us this morning on Top Story.
Nice to be here.
And we'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us. The entertainment industry lost 2 of its legendary stars last Wednesday. One a famed jazz trumpeter, the other a dancer. Dizzy Gillespie died in his sleep in New Jersey. His publicist says he was being treated for pancreatic cancer. Dizzy Gillespie was known around the world for a combination of blistering speed and a comic spirit. He was also one of the most recognizable trumpeters with his bent trumpet and balloon cheeks. Dizzy Gillespie was 75 years old. Rudolf Nureyev was the first Soviet dancer to defect to the West back in 1961. He went on to become the most celebrated classic ballet performer of his generation. It was widely reported that Rudolf Nureyev had AIDS. His doctors say he died of a cardiac complication following a cruel illness. Nureyev captivated audiences around the world. He was 54 years old. We leave you this week with some of the music created by the late Dizzy Gillespie, jazz tunes that may age but never grow old. I'm Ken Owen. That's Top Story. Have a great day.
Always knew that jazz was something special.